Alright, hold on tight because this one's gonna hit completely different. We're not talking about fan votes. We're not talking about streaming numbers. We're not talking about who trends the most on social media. Nope. Today, we're diving into something way more raw, way more real. What do the people who actually stood beside BTS in studios, on stages, behind cameras, and in boardrooms genuinely say about each member? Producers who spent sleepless nights crafting beats with them. Choreographers who watched them rehearse until their bodies literally gave out. Directors who captured their most vulnerable moments on film. Songwriters who sat across from them and witnessed how their minds actually work. These aren't opinions from behind a screen, these are testimonies from the trenches. Now here's where it gets spicy. Which member made a Grammy-winning producer completely rethink his entire approach to music? Who left a world-renowned director absolutely speechless, not because of talent alone, but because of something nobody saw coming? Which member do choreographers secretly say is the one they'd build an entire show around if they could only pick one? And who, and this one might genuinely shock you, is consistently called the most professional person in the entire entertainment industry by people who've collaborated with hundreds of global artists? The answers aren't what you think. The rankings aren't what you'd predict. And by the end of this list, you might just see your bias in a completely different light. So buckle up from number 7 all the way to number 1. Let's break it down. Number 7. Jimin. The atmosphere architect who made everyone forget they were working. Now before anyone comes at this list with pitchforks, let's get one thing absolutely crystal clear. Being number 7 on a list of BTS members is like being the 7th most breathtaking sunset on planet Earth. You're still a sunset. You're still magnificent. But when you're standing next to 6 other once-in-a-generation phenomena, the conversation gets ruthlessly competitive. And Jimin? Kim Seokjin? The man doesn't land here because people didn't enjoy working with him. He lands here because of the very specific nature of what collaborators remember most, and what they describe when cameras stop rolling is something unexpectedly fascinating. Let's start with the foundation. Jimin graduated from Konkuk University's Department of Film and Visual Arts, one of the more prestigious art programs in South Korea. That background isn't just a line on a resume. It fundamentally shaped how he approaches creative spaces. Multiple behind-the-scenes directors from Big Hit's own documentary crews have noted that Jimin possesses an almost instinctive understanding of camera angles, spatial awareness, and visual storytelling. During the filming of Burn the Stage, one of the production staff remarked in a behind-the-scenes interview that Jimin was one of the few idols they'd worked with who could sense when a scene needed levity without being directed to provide it. That's not a small thing. That's emotional intelligence operating in real time on a professional set. But here's where the conversation gets layered. When Coldplay's Chris Martin collaborated with BTS on My Universe in 2021, something interesting emerged from that creative exchange. Chris Martin, a man who has worked with literally everyone from Beyoncé to Rihanna to the Chainsmokers, singled Jimin out during multiple interviews, but not for the reason you might expect. He didn't talk about Jin's vocal technique or his musical instincts. What Chris Martin kept coming back to was Jin's ability to completely dissolve tension in a room. During the recording sessions, which were partly done remotely and partly in person, Martin described the atmosphere as immediately warmer whenever Jimin was present. He used the word disarming. Now, in the music industry, that quality is simultaneously deeply valued and strangely underrated. Producers and session engineers will tell you that the vibe in a recording booth can make or break a track. A nervous artist produces stiff vocals. A relaxed artist produces magic. And Jimin, according to multiple accounts from Big Hit's own producers like Dog and Slow Rabbit, is the member who most consistently brings that ease into the studio, not through technical dominance, but through sheer human warmth. When The Astronaut was being crafted, Jin's solo single co-written with Coldplay, the creative process revealed another dimension of how collaborators perceive him. Chris Martin and the Coldplay team have spoken about how Jimin approached the songwriting sessions with a humility that caught them off guard. Here's a guy who's part of the biggest band in human history, and he walked into those sessions not with demands or ego, but with genuine questions. Does this melody feel right to you? Can you help me understand why this chord progression hits differently? Phil Harvey, Coldplay's creative director and so-called fifth member, mentioned in a Rolling Stone UK piece that Jin reminded him of the early days of Coldplay, when the priority wasn't perfection, but sincerity. That comparison alone tells you something profound about the energy Jin brings into collaborative spaces. On the variety and television side, the story gets even more interesting. PDs. That's producing directors in Korean broadcast terminology, from shows like Run BTS and various Korean variety programs have consistently described Jin as the most broadcast-ready member of the group. Na Young-suk, arguably the most legendary variety PD in Korean entertainment history, has made subtle references to Jin's natural variety sense. Staff members from multiple Korean shows have gone on record saying Jin requires the least direction when it comes to creating entertaining moments. He reads the room, he understands timing, and his comedic instincts are almost scarily precise. And here's the critical, but that defines this ranking, when collaborators are asked specifically about the creative process, about pushing artistic boundaries, about those moments in the studio or on stage where someone did something that fundamentally changed the direction of a project, Jin's name comes up less frequently than the members ranked above him. It's not a criticism. It's a distinction. The vocal coaches who've worked with BTS over the years, including some who've trained K-pop idols across multiple generations, acknowledge Jin's remarkable improvement arc. His vocal journey from debut to The Astronaut is genuinely one of the most dramatic growth stories in modern K-pop. He went from being the member most frequently critiqued for live vocal instability to delivering performances like his solo stage at the 2022 Festa that left vocal professionals nodding in respect. One Seoul-based vocal instructor who has worked with trainees across SM, YG, and HYB described Jin's growth as proof that discipline can close almost any natural gap. That word discipline comes up constantly when professionals talk about Jin. Not raw genius. Not instinctive musicality. Discipline. Consistency. Reliability. And an atmosphere so genuinely positive that people forget they're in a high-pressure, multi-billion-dollar working environment. So why number 7? Because in a group where every single member brings something that makes industry veterans stop and pay attention, Jin's superpower is one that doesn't always translate into the kind of dramatic, quotable collaborative moments that define the rankings above him. He's the foundation that makes everything else possible. He's the reason the room feels safe enough for others to take risks. And every single person who has worked with BTS will tell you, sometimes the most important person on a team isn't the one who takes the spotlight, but the one who makes the spotlight possible for everyone else. Now, if you think this ranking started gentle, you're not ready for what's coming at number 6. Because the next member on this list left one of the biggest hip-hop producers in South Korea genuinely questioning whether idol music deserved more respect than he'd ever given it. Number 6. Suga. The silent producer who made hitmakers second-guess themselves. Let's talk about Yoongi. Because this is the member who creates a very specific kind of problem for anyone trying to rank BTS based on collaborator testimony. The problem being that half the people who've worked with him didn't even realize how deeply he'd reshaped their project until it was already finished. Suga doesn't walk into a room and announce his genius. He sits in the corner, barely speaks for the first hour, and then drops a single comment or a single melodic suggestion that makes everyone else in the studio go dead silent. That's not an exaggeration. That's a pattern described by multiple producers, songwriters, and artists who've shared creative space with him. And it starts way before BTS became a global phenomenon. Rewind to the early Bangtan days, pre-debut, when Yoongi was still an underground rapper in Daegu going by the name Gloss. The hip-hop community in South Korea during the early 2010s had a very rigid, very hostile gatekeeping culture. If you were an idol, or even training to become one, you were automatically dismissed. Your bars didn't matter. Your production skills didn't matter. You were manufactured, and that label stuck like a scar. Yoongi walked into that world knowing full well what it would cost him. He joined Big Hit Entertainment not because he wanted to be an idol, but because Bang Si-hyuk, Hitman Bang, promised him he could produce. That deal, That specific handshake agreement between a teenager from Daegu and a former JYP composer is one of the most consequential moments in modern music history, and almost nobody talks about it. Because that promise is what kept Yoongi in a system he often resented, and that tension, that friction between underground authenticity and idol industry machinery, became the fuel for everything he's ever created. Now fast forward to the collaborative testimonies. When Tableau, the leader of Epic High, a Stanford-educated lyricist and one of the most respected figures in Korean music history, spoke about Yoongi, he didn't use the words most people expect. He didn't say talented or hardworking. He said honest. And in the Korean hip-hop scene, where performative toughness and lyrical flexing dominate, calling someone honest is the highest compliment you can receive. Tableau elaborated in a radio interview that Yoongi's music made him uncomfortable, not in a negative way, but in the way that genuinely raw art forces you to confront things you've been avoiding. That reaction from a veteran like Tableau tells you everything about the kind of creative energy Yoongi brings into collaborative spaces. Then there's the IU sessions. When 8 was released in 2020, it became one of the biggest digital hits in Korean music history. But what most people don't know is how that collaboration actually unfolded behind closed doors. IU Lee Ji-yoon is notoriously selective about her collaborators. She's turned down producers and songwriters that most artists would beg to work with. When she agreed to work with Suga, the industry raised eyebrows. An idol producer working with the nation's sweetheart? But IU herself, in AV Live session after the release, described the experience with a word that shocked her own fans: effortless. She said Yoongi sent her the demo, she listened to it once, and immediately understood not just the song, but the entire emotional universe it existed in. No lengthy creative briefs. No back and forth about direction. He built a world in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and she walked right into it like she'd always lived there. That kind of creative clarity, the ability to communicate an entire vision through a demo alone, is something veteran producers spend decades trying to achieve. Yoongi did it so naturally that IU barely needed a conversation to understand it. The PSY collaboration takes this narrative in an entirely different direction. When that dropped in 2022, it wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural event. PSY, the man behind Gangnam Style, the artist who literally broke YouTube's view counter, chose Suga not just as a featured artist, but as the producer. Let that sink in. PSY has access to every producer on the planet. He's worked with will.i.am, Snoop Dogg, and some of the biggest names in American pop. And for his comeback, the one that needed to re-establish his relevance in a post-pandemic music landscape, he handed the keys to Min Yoongi. In behind-the-scenes content from P Nation, PSY's own label, staff members described watching Suga work in the studio with a mix of fascination and slight intimidation. One audio engineer noted that Suga would reject his own ideas faster than anyone could critique them. He'd build a beat, listen to it twice, delete it, and start over, not because it was bad, but because it wasn't exactly right. That perfectionism, that almost surgical precision in the production process, is what separates good producers from legendary ones. And PSY himself, a man with zero reason to flatter anyone, said publicly that Suga's production instincts were beyond his generation. But here's the tension that places Yoongi at number 6 instead of higher. When collaborators describe working with Suga, a recurring theme emerges: distance. Not coldness, not arrogance, but a kind of creative self-containment that can make the collaborative process feel more like receiving a gift than building something together. Halsey touched on this subtly when discussing Suga's interlude. She praised the track, praised his vision, but also noted that Yoongi's creative process is deeply internal. He arrives with so much of the work already done in his head that the collaborative space sometimes becomes more about execution than exploration. For some artists, that's a dream. They get a near-finished masterpiece and just add their color. For others, particularly those who thrive on the messy, unpredictable energy of real-time creative collision, it can feel like the most important conversations already happened before they entered the room. Max, the American singer who collaborated with Suga on Blueberry Eyes, echoed a similar sentiment with enormous respect. He described Suga as the most prepared person I've ever worked with, but also admitted that the preparation was so thorough it left less room for spontaneous, creative accidents, those happy mistakes that sometimes produce the most magical moments in music. So Yoongi sits at number 6, a position that acknowledges his undeniable genius as a producer and his ability to make collaborators deliver career-defining work, while also recognizing that the very quality that makes him extraordinary, his intense creative self-sufficiency, is the same quality that slightly limits the collaborative experience for those working alongside him. He doesn't need you to complete his vision. He needs you to inhabit it. And for most artists, inhabiting a Min Young vision is one of the greatest privileges of their career. But what happens when a collaborator meets a BTS member who doesn't just invite them into a vision, but makes them feel like the vision was theirs all along? That's exactly what the next member does, and the stories from the people who've experienced it will genuinely make you rethink everything you thought you knew about charisma. Number 5. Jungkook. The human sponge who made world-class producers feel like they discovered him first. Here's the thing about Jungkook that messes with every producer, every vocal coach, every choreographer, and every creative director who's ever shared a working space with him. They all walk away believing they witnessed something no one else has seen before. And the wildest part? They're all right. Because Jungkook doesn't just adapt to a collaborator's world. He absorbs it so completely, so instinctively, that the person sitting across from him genuinely starts to feel like this kid was built specifically for their project. That phenomenon, that almost unsettling ability to become exactly what a creative environment needs him to be, is what earned him the title Golden Magne long before the rest of the world caught on. But the people who've worked with him? They don't call him golden. They call him terrifying. And they mean it as the highest possible compliment. Let's start with Charlie Puth, because that collaboration cracked open something the industry had been whispering about for years. When Left and Right came together in 2022, Charlie Puth was already publicly obsessed with Jungkook's musicality. He'd said on multiple occasions that Jungkook had perfect pitch and an ear that most trained musicians spend a lifetime chasing. But what happened during the actual recording sessions went beyond what Charlie expected. In interviews and live streams after the release, Charlie described a moment that visibly still amazed him. Jungkook listened to the demo once, walked into the booth, and delivered a take so clean and so emotionally calibrated that Charlie's initial reaction was to check if Jungkook had somehow already rehearsed the song without telling him. He hadn't. That was a cold red. A single listen followed by a near-perfect vocal delivery that captured not just the melody, but the emotional texture Charlie had spent weeks trying to articulate to other vocalists. Charlie Puth, a Berklee College of Music graduate, a man who has dissected music theory on camera with an almost obsessive precision, sat in his studio chair and said, essentially, I don't understand how he does that. That testimony alone would be impressive enough. But then Andrew Watt entered the picture. Andrew Watt is not a casual name in the music industry. This is the producer behind Post Malone's Hollywood's Bleeding, Ozzy Osbourne's Grammy-winning comeback, Justin Bieber's Peaches, and tracks for the Rolling Stones, Pearl Jam, and Elton John. When Andrew Watt was tapped to produce Jungkook's solo debut single, the expectations were already stratospheric. But what happened in those sessions became industry legend before the song even dropped. Multiple sources close to the production described a dynamic that rarely occurs in pop music, a producer being pushed by the artist, not the other way around. What reportedly presented several versions of the production, each one polished and radio-ready. Jungkook listened to all of them, appreciated all of them, and then quietly asked if they could try something with a slightly different rhythmic feel. That slightly different rhythmic feel became the foundation of one of the biggest global hits of 2023, a song that debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and broke streaming records across every major platform. Staff present during those sessions described something fascinating about Jungkook's demeanor. He never positioned his suggestions as demands. He framed everything as curiosity. What if we tried? Do you think it would sound weird if? I was just thinking maybe. This approach, according to a mixing engineer who spoke about the sessions on a Korean podcast, created an environment where a Grammy-winning super producer felt comfortable being redirected by a K-pop idol 15 years younger than him. That's not just talent. That's emotional intelligence operating at a frequency most people never reach. The FIFA World Cup Dreamers performance added another layer to this narrative. When Jungkook was selected to perform at the opening ceremony of the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, the production team behind the event, a team that had worked with Shakira, J.Lo, and Pitbull for previous World Cup ceremonies, had a specific concern. Live stadium performances at that scale are brutally unforgiving. The acoustics are chaotic, the pressure is inhuman, and the margin for error is essentially zero. According to production notes that surfaced in a Korean media retrospective, the team was prepared for extensive rehearsals and multiple contingency plans. Jungkook arrived, did 2 rehearsals, and the production team reportedly looked at each other and decided he was ready. 2 rehearsals. For a performance broadcast to an estimated 2 billion people worldwide. One of the stage directors later told a Korean media outlet that Jungkook's spatial awareness, his ability to command a massive open stadium the same way he'd command an intimate concert hall, was not something you teach. It was instinct. Now, the choreography dimension deserves its own analysis. Sung-Duk, BTS's legendary performance director, has been working with the group since their trainee days. Over the years, he's made comments about each member's strengths, and when it comes to Jungkook, the recurring word is immediate. Where other dancers process choreography intellectually, breaking down counts, analyzing weight transfers, repeating sequences until muscle memory kicks in, Jungkook's body seems to understand movement before his conscious mind catches up. Sung-Duk has described moments in rehearsal where he'd demonstrate a new sequence once, turn around to explain it, and find Jungkook already doing it behind him. Not approximately. Precisely. Multiple backup dancers who've toured with BTS have shared similar stories on social media and in interviews. Jungkook picks up choreography so fast that he sometimes has to deliberately slow himself down so the group can learn it together. But, and here's the critical nuance that places Jungkook at number 5 rather than higher, when collaborators dig deeper, when they move past the awe and analyze the creative dynamic more carefully, a pattern emerges. Jungkook's greatest strength, his ability to become exactly what a project needs, is paradoxically what some collaborators identify as a still evolving edge. Several producers who've worked across the K-pop and Western pop landscape have noted that Jungkook's instinct to serve the song, to mold himself to the producer's vision, sometimes means the collaboration feels more like a masterful execution than a creative collision. He gives you everything you want so perfectly that you occasionally miss the friction, that productive resistance, that can push a project into truly unexpected territory. With his solo album, Golden, there were glimpses of that friction starting to emerge. Tracks like Standing Next to You showed Jungkook not just absorbing influences, but wrestling with them, bending Motown and funk and retro pop through a filter that was distinctly his. Producers involved in those sessions noted a subtle but meaningful shift. Jungkook was starting to say no more. Not rudely, not dramatically, but with a quiet confidence that suggested the human sponge was beginning to decide which waters he actually wanted to absorb. That evolution is precisely why the industry watches Jungkook with a kind of breathless anticipation. The talent was never in question. The adaptability was never in question. What's emerging now is something even more exciting, an artist who can do anything beginning to choose what he wants to be. And that journey from infinite potential to intentional artistry is one of the most compelling stories in modern music. Speaking of intentional artistry, the member sitting at number 4 took an entirely different path. While Jungkook makes collaborators feel like he was made for their world, the next member on this list builds worlds so vivid, so unapologetically personal, that collaborators have no choice but to step inside. And what they find in there? It's left some of the most seasoned creative professionals in the industry genuinely speechless. Number 4. V. The untrained auteur whose artistic instincts left industry veterans shook. Kim Taehyung is the anomaly that no one in the music industry has quite figured out how to categorize, and honestly, the people who've worked closest with him have stopped trying. Because here's what happens when you put V in a creative room. The rules change. Not loudly. Not with some dramatic declaration of artistic rebellion. The rules just quietly dissolve, and suddenly everyone in that space is operating on a frequency they didn't know existed. Following a creative logic that makes absolutely no traditional sense, but somehow produces results so stunning that nobody dares question the process. That experience, that bewildering, almost hypnotic creative energy, is what collaborators describe more consistently about V than any other quality. And the fact that it comes from someone with zero formal music training before joining Big Hit makes the whole thing even more fascinating to the professionals who witness it. Let's rewind to the beginning because V's origin story sets the stage for everything. Unlike most idol trainees who audition with polished vocals or choreography, Taehyung famously accompanied a friend to the Big Hit audition and was encouraged by staff to audition himself almost as an afterthought. He was the secret audition. The accident. The kid nobody planned for. And yet, within that chaotic, unscripted moment, the casting directors saw something they couldn't articulate but absolutely couldn't ignore, a raw, undefined magnetism that operated entirely outside the standard idol evaluation framework. That story isn't just a cute origin tale. It's a blueprint for how V has operated in every collaborative space since. He doesn't arrive with a plan. He arrives with a feeling. And that feeling, according to the people who've worked with him, is so powerful and so specific that it reshapes the entire project around it. Min Hee-jin, and if you know anything about the creative architecture of modern K-pop, that name should make you sit up straight, is the legendary creative director who shaped the visual identities of some of the most iconic K-pop eras before going on to create new genes. During her years at Big Hit, she worked directly with BTS on concepts, visual narratives, and artistic direction. And when she spoke about V, the language she used was different from how she described any other idol she'd ever worked with. She called his artistic instincts innate. Not developed. Not trained. Innate. She described moments during concept photo shoots where V would ignore the directed pose, do something entirely unexpected, and produce an image so compelling that it became the defining shot of the entire album concept. Photographers who've worked with him tell almost identical stories. A fashion photographer who shot V for a major magazine cover told a Korean media outlet that working with Taehyung was like photographing someone who exists in a different timeline. He didn't pose for the camera. He inhabited a character, a mood, an entire emotional landscape, and the photographer's job became less about directing and more about simply keeping up. That same photographer, who had shot campaigns for brands across Paris, Milan, and New York, admitted that V was one of only 3 subjects in his career who made him rethink his own creative process. Not through feedback or critique, but through the sheer force of what he brought to the frame without being asked. Now, the music. The music is where V's collaborative story gets genuinely extraordinary. When Stigma was being developed for BTS's Wings album, the production team, including Dog, one of Big Hit's cornerstone producers, faced an unusual challenge. The track required a neo-soul vocal approach that was radically different from anything BTS had done before. The conventional choice would have been to coach V extensively, break down the genre's technical requirements, and build his performance from a foundation of theory. Instead, something else happened. Dog played V a handful of classic neo-soul references, and V, without any formal understanding of the genre's harmonic conventions or vocal techniques, delivered an interpretation that wasn't just competent, but was dripping with an emotional authenticity that left the production team exchanging glances. He didn't replicate neo-soul. He filtered it through whatever nameless thing lives inside his creative consciousness and produced something that felt simultaneously vintage and completely alien. That moment reportedly changed how Big Hit's production team approached V on subsequent projects. They stopped trying to teach him genres and started feeding him emotions. The evolution from Stigma to Singularity proves this approach worked spectacularly. When choreographer Keone Madrid created the choreography for Singularity, the creative brief wasn't about dance technique or synchronization. It was about seduction, about tension, about the space between movement and stillness. Keone, who has choreographed for Justin Bieber, Billie Eilish, and numerous top-tier performers, later posted about the experience with a reverence that stood out even by his generous standards. He described V's body as thinking differently from trained dancers, not better, not worse, but operating on a fundamentally different logic that produced movements trained dancers couldn't replicate because they'd been taught to move correctly. V hadn't been burdened with correctness. He moved with an organic, almost painterly quality that turned Singularity from a performance into a piece of living art. His solo album, Layover, in 2023 crystallized everything collaborators had been observing for years. The album's creative direction leaned heavily into jazz, R&B, and a kind of atmospheric intimacy that is almost unheard of in the K-pop solo landscape. Producers who worked on the project described sessions that defied standard workflow. Where most artists come in with reference tracks and specific sonic goals, V came in with colors. Literally. He would describe a song he wanted in terms of visual tones. I want this track to feel like navy blue at 2 a.m., and the producers would have to translate that synesthetic direction into actual musical choices. It sounds absurd on paper. In practice, according to the Layover team, it produced some of the most emotionally coherent music they'd ever been part of creating. The fashion world adds yet another dimension. When Hedy Slimane, the creative director of Celine and one of the most influential figures in modern fashion history, personally selected V as the house's global ambassador, the fashion press noticed something unusual. Slimane, a man legendarily protective of his brand's aesthetic, gave V an unusual degree of creative latitude. Insiders familiar with Celine's campaigns noted that V didn't just wear the clothes. He recontextualized them. He brought a quality that fashion professionals struggled to name, part old Hollywood, part Parisian melancholy, part something entirely Korean and entirely Taehyung. That elevated the brand's visual language in a way no other celebrity ambassador had achieved. So why number 4 and not higher? Because the same quality that makes V transcendent in creative spaces, his reliance on instinct over structure, on feeling over framework, is what some collaborators identify as a double-edged sword in the mechanics of professional partnership. His process, while producing breathtaking results, can be unpredictable in ways that create challenges for collaborators who operate within tight timelines and structured workflows. Several producers have noted, always with affection, that working with V requires a surrender of control that not every creative professional is equipped for. You can't plan a session with him the way you'd plan a session with a technically trained artist. You have to leave space for whatever's going to happen. And while what happens is often extraordinary, the uncertainty of the journey is a factor that separates V from the members ranked above him. Members whose collaborative processes are equally brilliant, but offer their partners a different kind of creative partnership. V is the artist who makes you believe in magic again. The members above him? They make you believe in something even rarer, magic you can build with someone else, brick by astonishing brick. And the member at number 3? The stories from their collaborators don't just impress, they haunt. Because what this person does in a rehearsal room has literally reduced veteran choreographers to silence, and the reason why isn't what anyone expects. Number 3, Jimin, the perfectionist who made choreographers forget they were supposed to be teaching. There is a moment, and every single choreographer who has ever worked with BTS describes some version of it, where the rehearsal room goes quiet. Not because someone made a mistake. Not because the music stopped. But because Park Jimin just did something with his body that no one in the room, including the person who created the choreography, knew was possible within the sequence they designed. And that silence? That specific, heavy, almost sacred silence? It's the sound of professionals realizing they're witnessing something that transcends the craft they've spent their entire lives mastering. That phenomenon is not fan exaggeration. It's not the internet being dramatic. It's a documented, repeated, almost predictable occurrence that happens with such regularity that the people closest to BTS's performance machinery have essentially built it into their expectations. When you choreograph for Jimin, you don't just create steps. You create a framework and then wait, because Jimin is going to do something with that framework that you never imagined, and it's going to be better than what you planned. That reality, confirmed by choreographer after choreographer, producer after producer, is what places Park Jimin at number 3 on this list. And the depth of why requires understanding where this man came from. Jimin didn't enter the idol system through the typical pipeline. Before Big Hit, before BTS, before any of this, he was the top student at Busan High School of Arts in the contemporary dance department. Not pop dance. Not street dance. Not the hip-hop foundation that most male K-pop idols build their movement vocabulary on. Contemporary dance, the form that treats the human body as an instrument of emotional storytelling, where every extension of a finger, every tilt of the head, every controlled fall carries narrative weight. That training didn't just give Jimin technical skills. It rewired how he understands movement at a fundamental level. While most idol dancers think in terms of hitting beats and executing formations, Jimin thinks in terms of breath, tension, release, and the invisible emotional architecture between movements. Sung-Duk, BTS's performance director and the man who has arguably shaped the physical language of the group more than any other single individual, has spoken about this difference with a directness that borders on reverence. In multiple behind-the-scenes features and interviews over the years, Sung-Duk has described Jimin as the member who requires the least correction, but demands the most from himself. And that distinction is crucial. Because Jimin's perfectionism isn't the kind that seeks external validation. It's the kind that operates on an internal standard so impossibly high that the people around him sometimes have to physically intervene to stop him from destroying his own body in pursuit of it. Backup dancers who've toured with BTS on their world tours have shared stories that paint a picture of almost frightening dedication. During the Love Yourself World Tour, multiple dancers described arriving at rehearsal venues hours early, only to find Jimin already there, drenched in sweat, running sequences he'd already perfected by any reasonable standard. When asked why he was still practicing, his answer was always some variation of the same theme: it doesn't feel right yet. Not, it doesn't look right. Not, I'm not hitting the mark. It doesn't feel right. That vocabulary, the insistence on feeling over appearance, is what separates Jimin from virtually every other performer in the K-pop landscape, according to the professionals who work across the industry. A Seoul-based choreographer who has trained idols for 3 different major agencies put it bluntly in a Korean dance magazine interview: most idols learn to look like they're feeling the music. Jimin actually feels it. And that difference is visible from the back row of a stadium. Now let's talk about what happened in the studio, because Jimin's collaborative story extends far beyond the rehearsal room. When Phase was being developed, his debut solo album released in 2023, the production team encountered something they hadn't fully anticipated. Jimin, long perceived by casual observers as primarily a performer and dancer, arrived at those sessions with a creative intentionality that caught even seasoned Hybe producers off guard. He wasn't there to sing songs that had been written for him. He was there to excavate something deeply personal and translate it into sound. Producers who worked on tracks like Crazy described sessions where Jimin would record a vocal take, listen to it back, and then ask to try again, not because the take was technically flawed, but because it didn't carry the exact emotional frequency he was hearing in his head. One producer described the experience as chasing a feeling that only Jimin could hear, and the frustration and exhilaration of that chase in equal measure. The result spoke for itself, like Crazy debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making Jimin the first Korean solo artist to achieve that milestone. But the Billboard achievement, as staggering as it is, almost obscures the more important story happening underneath. When collaborators talk about that recording process, they don't lead with chart positions. They lead with the atmosphere Jimin created in the studio, an environment of relentless emotional honesty that pushed everyone involved to work at a level they didn't know they could reach. Then came Muse in 2024, and the collaborative Testimonies evolved again, who became a global phenomenon. But what producers remember most isn't the commercial success, it's the way Jimin approached the concept of the album as a unified emotional journey rather than a collection of songs. He challenged producers on track sequencing, debated the emotional arc between songs, and insisted that the album's narrative coherence mattered as much as any individual track's hit-making potential. That level of artistic ownership from a solo artist in the K-pop system, where albums are often assembled by committee, is rare enough to be remarkable. Coming from someone the industry had long categorized primarily as a dancer-performer, it was genuinely revelatory. The singularity versus serendipity conversation is worth pausing on because it reveals something collaborators noticed early. Both are solo performances within BTS's album cycle. Singularity was V's abstract, instinctive, painterly. Serendipity was Jimin's, and the approach couldn't have been more different. Choreographic teams who worked on both pieces described Jimin's process as archaeological. Where V improvised and discovered, Jimin excavated and refined. He would take a single 8-count of choreography and work it for hours, not changing the steps, but deepening their meaning, adjusting the speed of a hand movement by fractions of a second, altering the angle of his gaze by millimeters, finding new emotional textures within movements that were already performance-ready. The choreographer who led the serendipity sessions reportedly told colleagues afterward that it was the first time in their career they felt a performer had found more in their choreography than they had put into it. That statement, the idea that Jimin extracts meaning from movement that even its creator didn't consciously embed, is perhaps the single most telling collaborator testimony about any BTS member on this entire list. It suggests an artist who doesn't just perform work but completes it. Who doesn't just execute a vision, but fulfills it beyond its creator's own understanding. The physical cost of this approach is something collaborators mention with a mix of admiration and genuine concern. Jimin's injury history, his well-documented battles with physical exhaustion, the moments captured on camera where his body simply refuses to cooperate with the demands his mind places on it, these aren't just personal struggles. They're evidence of a creative standard so uncompromising that it operates at the very edge of what the human body can sustain. Medical staff and physical therapists who've worked with BTS have reportedly singled Jimin out as the member most likely to push past safe physical limits, not out of recklessness, but out of a genuinely inability to accept anything less than the impossible standard he's set for himself. So Jimin sits at number 3. A ranking that reflects the overwhelming weight of collaborator testimony describing an artist who transforms every creative space he enters, who elevates every collaborator's work beyond what they thought it could be, and who pays for that elevation with a physical and emotional investment that borders on sacrificial. He doesn't just meet the moment. He becomes the moment. And every person who has ever shared a stage, a studio, or a rehearsal room with him carries the memory of that experience like a creative scar, beautiful, permanent, and impossible to fully explain to anyone who wasn't there. But if Jimin is the one who makes choreographers forget they were teaching, the member at number 2 is the one who made them realize they'd been thinking about performance completely wrong. And the story of how that happened involves a legendary rehearsal that people in the Hybe building still talk about in whispers. Number 2, J-Hope, the dance general whose leadership made entire production teams rewrite their standards. Every group has a center. Every team has a leader on paper. But very rarely, across any industry, any art form, any era, does a group have a single individual who so fundamentally defines the collective standard of excellence that removing them would alter not just the quality, but the very identity of everything the group produces. In BTS, that person is young Hoseok. And the people who've worked with him don't just acknowledge this. They say it with the kind of quiet, almost reverent certainty that you only hear when professionals are describing something they've genuinely never encountered before. J-Hope at number 2 isn't a ranking based on popularity, on stage presence in the conventional sense, or on the kind of viral moments that dominate fan compilations. This ranking exists because when you sit down with the choreographers, the performance directors, the stage managers, the backup dancers, the tour production crews, and the creative teams who've built BTS's legendary live performances from the ground up, one name comes up with a frequency and an intensity that separates it from every other conversation. And the stories they tell don't just impress. They fundamentally redefine what it means to be a performer, a collaborator, and a leader in the same breath. Start in Gwangju. Before Big Hit, before the trainee system ground down his edges and rebuilt him for the idol machine, Hoseok was already a legend in the South Korean underground dance scene, and he was a teenager. He was part of a street dance crew called Neuron, and he didn't just participate. He won a national dance competition at an age when most kids are still figuring out how to coordinate their limbs to a beat. Hoseok was already commanding stages with a technical precision and performative charisma that made adult competitors openly uncomfortable. The judges at those competitions, veterans of Korea's street dance culture, people who'd spent decades evaluating movement, described the young Hoseok with a word that kept surfacing: complete. Not promising. Not talented for his age. Complete. His popping was surgical. His locking was explosive. His musicality, the ability to hear rhythmic nuances within a beat and translate them into physical vocabulary in real time, was operating at a level that typically requires a decade or more of dedicated training. He had it before he'd finished middle school. That foundation is essential context for understanding what happened when Hoseok entered Big Hit's trainee system and eventually became J-Hope. Because he didn't just bring his skills into BTS. He brought an entire philosophy of performance, one rooted in the street dance principle that movement must be honest, that every gesture must earn its place, and that technique without soul is just gymnastics. And that philosophy didn't stay confined to his own performances. It infected the entire group. Sun Sung-duk, and by now you understand the weight this name carries in BTS's creative universe, has been more explicit about J-Hope's role than about any other member's contribution to the group's performance identity. In multiple interviews, documentary segments, and behind-the-scenes features, Sung-duk has described J-Hope not as BTS's best dancer, though he is, but as BTS's performance architect. The distinction matters enormously. Being the best dancer means you execute movements at the highest level. Being the performance architect means you're the reason everyone else executes at a level they didn't think they could reach. Sung-duk has described a specific workflow that has defined BTS's rehearsal process for years. He creates the choreography. He teaches it to J-Hope first. And then, and this is the part that makes industry professionals stop and stare, J-Hope essentially becomes the second choreographer in the room. He translates the movements for each member individually, adjusting angles, timing, and energy to suit their specific body mechanics and performance styles. He doesn't teach them to dance like him. He teaches them to dance like the best versions of themselves within the framework of the choreography. That skill, the ability to simultaneously be the standard and the teacher, the peak performer and the most patient mentor, is so rare in the entertainment industry that multiple choreographers who've worked across SM, YG, JYP, and HYB have described it as essentially unique to J-Hope. One choreographer, who requested anonymity but whose credits span multiple generation-defining K-pop groups, told a Korean dance publication something that sent shockwaves through the industry when it was published. If J-Hope had never been in BTS, BTS would not move the way BTS moves. You can replace a dancer. You cannot replace the person who taught every other member what dancing actually means. That quote alone could justify this ranking. But the collaborative testimonies go so much deeper. Backup dancers from BTS's World Tours, the Map of the Soul tour, the Permission to Dance on Stage concerts, the stadium shows that redefined what K-pop live performance could be, have painted a picture of J-Hope that borders on mythological. Multiple dancers, across different tours and different years, describe the same phenomenon. J-Hope is always the last person to leave rehearsal. Not because he needs more practice, he's typically the first to nail every sequence, but because he stays to work with whoever is struggling. Not the BTS members. The backup dancers. The hired performers who are already professionals in their own right. J-Hope would notice a dancer in the core who wasn't quite connecting with a transition, walk over during a break, and spend 30 minutes working through it with them, not as a superior correcting an underling, but as a fellow dancer helping a colleague find their center. One backup dancer posted on social media after a tour ended that J-Hope had helped her fix a technical issue with her isolations that 3 years of professional training hadn't resolved. He watched her move for 5 minutes, identified the problem, and offered a correction so precise and so gently delivered that she cried, not from frustration, but from the overwhelming realization that one of the most famous performers on earth had just given her a masterclass because he genuinely cared whether she felt good about her own performance. The Lollapalooza headline set in 2022 brought J-Hope's collaborative impact into an entirely different arena. When he became the first Korean artist to headline a main stage at a major American music festival, the production team behind the show had a specific set of expectations. They'd worked with rock bands, hip-hop superstars, and pop icons. They had frameworks. They had templates. And J-Hope, within the first production meeting, essentially asked them to throw all of it away. The festival's stage manager later told a music industry podcast that J-Hope's preparation for the set was unlike anything they'd encountered. He didn't just plan his performance. He planned the audience's experience, mapping out energy arcs across the entire set, identifying moments where the crowd would need recovery time, and building transitions that treated the audience as active participants rather than passive observers. The production team, initially skeptical that a K-pop soloist could command a Lollapalooza main stage the way a legacy rock act would, watched the show from backstage and realized within the first 3 songs that they'd fundamentally underestimated what they were dealing with. The crowd response was seismic. Not polite. Not enthusiastic. Seismic. Number 1 RM. The mind that made the entire machine believe it could change the world, and then actually did. There's a story that floats around the upper floors of Hybe's headquarters in Yongsan, Seoul, not in official documents, not in press releases, but in the quiet conversations between producers, songwriters, A&R executives, and creative directors who've been with the company long enough to remember what it felt like before any of this was real. The story goes like this. In the early days, when Big Hit Entertainment was a struggling mid-tier agency hemorrhaging money, when the trainee lineup that would become BTS was still being assembled and reassembled like a puzzle no one was sure how to solution, Bang Si-hyuk, Hitman Bang, the founder, the architect, the man who bet his entire career on a group of teenagers, sat in a room with his senior staff and said something that would define everything that followed. He said, as long as we have Namjoon, we have a group. Not as long as we have talent. Not as long as we have visuals, or dance skills, or vocal ability. As long as we have Namjoon. That statement, raw, absolute, almost reckless in its certainty, is the foundational testimony of this entire ranking. Because every collaborator who has ever worked with BTS, whether they spent 5 minutes in a room with RM or 5 years building albums alongside him, eventually arrives at the same conclusion that Bang Si-hyuk reached before any of them. Kim Namjoon is not just the leader of BTS. He is the reason BTS exists as an artistic entity rather than merely a commercial product. And the evidence for that claim isn't anecdotal. It's architectural. It's embedded in the DNA of over 200 songwriting credits spanning a discography that reshaped the entire global music industry. Let's begin where every serious conversation about RM's collaborative impact must begin, the writing room. Dog, Big Hit's chief producer and the sonic architect behind the majority of BTS's most iconic tracks, has spoken about RM's role in the creative process with a specificity that borders on clinical. In interviews and documentary segments spanning nearly a decade, Dog has consistently described RM not as a contributor to BTS's music, but as a co-architect. The distinction is the same one that separates a session musician from a bandleader, a hired pen from a novelist. When BTS enters the conceptual phase of a new album, the period where themes are identified, narratives are structured, and the emotional arc of an entire body of work is mapped out, RM isn't consulted. He leads. He arrives at those meetings with handwritten notes, philosophical references, literary allusions, and conceptual frameworks so thoroughly developed that the production team's job often becomes translating his vision into sound rather than creating a vision from scratch. Slow Rabbit, another cornerstone producer in the Hybe system, described a specific moment during the development of the Love Yourself series that has become legendary within the company. RM presented the narrative structure for what would become a 4-album conceptual arc exploring self-love, self-denial, and emotional reckoning, a structure inspired by Eric Fromm's The Art of Loving, and filtered through RM's own philosophical framework. The production team listened, exchanged glances, and realized they were no longer working on a K-pop album. They were working on a thesis. A musical argument about the human condition, proposed by a 23-year-old idol rapper who had taught himself English by watching Friends and taught himself philosophy by haunting the bookstores of Hongdae. That moment, that specific creative turning point, is what multiple HYB insiders point to when asked when BTS stopped being a very successful boy band and became a cultural movement. And it was driven entirely by the mind of Kim Namjoon. The international collaborations amplify this story into something almost surreal. When Pharrell Williams worked with BTS, the interactions that received the most attention were the polished interview moments, two musical forces exchanging compliments on camera. But behind those cameras, something more significant was happening. Multiple sources familiar with those sessions described Pharrell's genuine surprise at RM's creative depth. Pharrell, a man who has produced for Jay-Z, Beyoncé, Daft Punk, and Snoop Dogg, a man who has literally shaped the sound of 3 decades of popular music, reportedly told his team after working with RM that the BTS leader had one of the most architecturally sophisticated, creative minds he'd encountered. Not just in K-pop. Not just among young artists. Among anyone. That word, architectural, is the key to understanding why RM sits at the undisputed summit of this ranking. Because while other BTS members bring extraordinary individual talents to collaborative spaces, RM brings structure. He brings the blueprint that makes every other talent legible. He walks into a room with Western producers who don't speak Korean, who don't understand K-pop conventions, who have no framework for bridging the cultural gap between Seoul and Los Angeles, and he becomes the bridge. Not just linguistically, though his English fluency is itself a remarkable collaborative tool. Conceptually, he translates Korean emotional sensibilities into universal creative language with such precision that producers who've worked with global superstars across every genre describe the experience as revelatory. 7 members. 7 entirely different stories told by the people who didn't just watch BTS from a screen. They stood beside them, built with them, argued with them, stayed up until 4 a.m. in studios with them, and walked away carrying experiences they'll reference for the rest of their careers. And when you lay all 7 testimonies side by side, something extraordinary emerges, a picture of a group that isn't just talented, but architecturally perfect in how each member's strengths fill the exact spaces the others leave open. At number 7, Jin taught us that the most valuable person in any creative room might be the one who makes everyone else feel safe enough to be brilliant, the atmosphere architect whose warmth turned high-pressure studios into spaces where magic could happen. At number 6, Suga revealed that genius doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner and drops a single idea so precise that it reshapes the entire project. A silent producer whose creative self-sufficiency produced masterpieces that collaborators were honored to simply inhabit. At number 5, Jungkook showed us the terrifying beauty of infinite adaptability, a human sponge so instinctively talented that every producer who worked with him believed they'd discovered something no one else had seen, and who is now beginning the even more exciting journey of choosing exactly who he wants to become. At number 4, V shattered every rule about formal training and technical prerequisites, an untrained auteur whose artistic instincts operate on a frequency that leaves industry veterans speechless, proving that sometimes the most profound creativity comes not from knowledge, but from an innate emotional intelligence that can't be taught, only witnessed. At number 3, Jimin redefined what perfectionism means not as an obsession with flawlessness, but as a relentless excavation of emotional truth through movement and sound. A performer so dedicated to feeling over appearance that choreographers found more depth in his interpretations than they'd consciously embedded in their own work. At number 2, J-Hope proved that the highest form of individual excellence is making everyone around you excellent too. A dance general whose leadership didn't just shape BTS's legendary synchronization, but fundamentally redefined what collaborative performance could look like, from rehearsal rooms to the main stage of Lollapalooza. And at number 1, RM showed us why vision matters more than any single skill. The mind that turned 7 talented individuals into a cultural movement, the bridge that connected Korean artistry to global audiences, and the leader whose intellectual depth, emotional sincerity, and creative architecture made every single person who ever worked with him believe they were doing the most important work of their lives. That's not just a group. That's a once-in-a-generation convergence of human beings whose individual gifts, when combined, produce something greater than the sum of its parts, something that Grammy producers, UN officials, legendary choreographers, and industry titans all agree they may never see again. And the most beautiful part? Every single one of these 7 stories was told not by fans, not by algorithms, not by marketing teams, but by the people who were actually there. The people who saw it with their own eyes, heard it with their own ears, and felt it in the moments that cameras never captured. That's BTS. Ranked not by the world that watched them, but by the world that built alongside them. And on that note, this list is closed.